December 28, 2024. A crisp winter morning in Brandon, Mississippi. A quiet suburban community where neighbors know each other's names and families gather for Sunday dinners. On this particular morning, cars belonging to concerned relatives pulled up outside a modest single-family home on a tree-lined street. They were there for what should have been an ordinary family visit, a post-holiday gathering to check in on loved ones. But the scene that greeted them was anything but ordinary. Both vehicles sat parked in the garage, Jennifer's and Brandon's, indicating they were home. Yet no one answered the door. Phone calls went straight to voicemail. Text messages remained unread. As minutes turned to hours, concern morphed into panic. What these family members couldn't have known was that behind the locked door of that quiet suburban home lay a tragedy that would expose one of the darkest truths about domestic violence. That the moment a victim decides to leave is often the moment they are in the greatest danger. This is the story of Jennifer and Brandon Sheffield, and the illusion of the perfect divorce. To understand what happened on that cold December morning, we need to go back to the beginning, to a love story that, from the outside, seemed destined for happiness. Jennifer Sheffield was 30 years old at the time of her death, but she had already accomplished what many spend a lifetime working toward. A registered nurse with a reputation for compassion and clinical excellence, Jennifer was known throughout her hospital as someone who genuinely cared about her patients. She didn't just treat symptoms. She treated people. Colleagues would later describe her as the kind of nurse who remembered birthdays, who stayed late to hold a frightened patient's hand, who brought homemade treats to share during grueling night shifts. But Jennifer's achievements extended far beyond the hospital walls. She was an academic overachiever, someone who approached learning with genuine passion rather than mere obligation. Whether she was pursuing continuing education credits, studying the latest medical research, or simply reading for personal enrichment, Jennifer maintained an intellectual curiosity that inspired those around her. Friends recall her always having a book in her bag, always ready to discuss a new idea or perspective she'd encountered. Above all else, Jennifer was a mother. She had 2 daughters who were the center of her world. Gracie, Brandon's daughter from a previous relationship, and Kylie, the daughter Jennifer and Brandon shared together. By all accounts, Jennifer made no distinction between the 2 girls. She loved them equally, fiercely, completely. She attended every school event, helped with homework at the kitchen table, planned elaborate birthday celebrations, and created family traditions that the girls looked forward to each year. Brandon Sheffield was 40 years old, a full decade older than his wife. To the outside world, he appeared to be a devoted husband and father. He worked steadily, provided for his family, and participated in community events. Neighbors would later tell investigators that the Sheffields seemed like a stable, happy family. They saw Brandon coaching Little League, mowing the lawn on Saturday mornings, washing cars in the driveway alongside his daughters. The couple's love story began in the mid-2000s, during a time when both were looking for stability and partnership. Their courtship was relatively brief but intense, and by the late 2000s or early 2010s, they had married and begun building a life together. Brandon brought his daughter Gracie into the marriage, and Jennifer embraced her role as stepmother with the same dedication she brought to everything else in her life. When Kylie was born, the family felt complete. For more than a decade, the Sheffields lived what appeared to be an enviable life. They attended church functions, hosted backyard barbecues, took family vacations to the Gulf Coast. On social media, their feeds showed smiling faces at Disney World, Christmas mornings surrounded by wrapping paper, date nights at local restaurants. Jennifer frequently posted about her gratitude for her family, her career, her blessings. But sometime in late 2024, cracks began to appear in the foundation of the Sheffield marriage. The first public indication came when both Jennifer and Brandon changed their Facebook relationship status. No longer married, now simply single. In an era where relationship updates are broadcast instantly to hundreds of online connections, this digital declaration sent ripples through their social circle. Friends and family members saw the notifications pop up on their feeds. Some reached out with concerned messages. Others waited, uncertain whether to acknowledge the change or give the couple privacy. What made the situation particularly unusual was how Jennifer and Brandon both presented the separation. There were no angry posts, no vague booking about betrayal or heartbreak, no digital warfare playing out in comment sections. Instead, both parties seemed committed to portraying their divorce as mature, amicable, and mutually respectful. Jennifer, in particular, went out of her way to emphasize that this was a positive change, a conscious uncoupling, to borrow a phrase that had become popular in recent years. She posted about growth, about new beginnings, about the importance of prioritizing happiness and personal fulfillment. Then came December 10, 2024. On that day, Jennifer posted a video to TikTok that would, in retrospect, mark the beginning of an 18-day countdown to tragedy. In the video, she spoke directly to the camera with a smile on her face and optimism in her voice. She talked about the divorce, framing it as an opportunity rather than a failure. She discussed her plans for independence, her excitement about starting a new chapter, her determination to create a life that felt authentic and fulfilling. "I'm finally doing this for me," she told her followers. "I'm taking control of my own happiness." The video garnered supportive comments from friends and strangers alike. People praised her courage. They celebrated her strength. They wished her well on her journey of self-discovery. What none of them could have known, what perhaps even Jennifer herself didn't fully realize, was that she had just started the clock on the most dangerous period of her life. Domestic violence experts have long understood a terrifying truth. The moment a victim decides to leave an abusive relationship is often the moment when they are at the highest risk of being killed. It's a phenomenon so well documented that it has its own terminology in the field: separation violence. And the statistics are chilling. The majority of intimate partner homicides occur either during the process of separation or shortly after a victim has left the relationship. Jennifer had just announced her independence to the world. She had made her intentions clear, public, irreversible. The countdown had begun. Between December 10th and December 28th, 2024, Jennifer Sheffield lived her life with apparent confidence and optimism. To her social media followers, to her colleagues at the hospital, even to many of her friends and family members, she seemed to be handling the divorce with remarkable grace and maturity. But those 18 days, barely more than 2.5 weeks, would become the subject of intense scrutiny after the tragedy. In examining that period, a more complex picture emerges. One that reveals both Jennifer's remarkable strength and the invisible threat that was growing more dangerous with each passing day. Jennifer continued working her regular shifts at the hospital throughout this period. Colleagues reported that she seemed focused and professional, though perhaps more quiet than usual. During breaks, she occasionally opened up about her plans for the future. She talked about finding a new apartment where she and the girls could start fresh. She mentioned possibly going back to school to pursue an advanced degree. She spoke about traveling, about possibilities, about dreams deferred that might finally be realized. One coworker would later tell investigators, "She seemed almost lighter, like a weight had been lifted. I remember thinking she was so brave to make such a big change." At home, the situation was undoubtedly more complicated. Jennifer and Brandon were still living under the same roof while they worked out the details of their separation. This is not an uncommon arrangement. Financial constraints, child custody considerations, and simple logistics often mean that divorcing couples must cohabitate during the transition period. But it's also a scenario that domestic violence experts consider extremely high risk. Living with someone you're leaving creates a pressure cooker environment. Every interaction becomes charged with emotion. Every decision about custody, property, finances becomes a potential flashpoint. And for an abuser, particularly one whose primary method of control has been psychological rather than physical, the loss of power that comes with separation can trigger increasingly dangerous behavior. Friends who spoke with Jennifer during this time reported that she was careful, almost strategic, in how she discussed Brandon. She emphasized that they were staying civil for the kids. She insisted that they were being mature about the situation. She repeatedly used phrases like mutual respect and amicable separation. At face value, this seemed admirable. Look at Jennifer, people thought, handling such a difficult situation with such grace and wisdom. But domestic violence advocates recognize this pattern all too well. It's called protective pretense when a victim publicly portrays a separation as peaceful and mutual, not because it actually is, but because maintaining that fiction is a survival strategy. By insisting everything is fine, by avoiding any statements that might be perceived as criticism or blame, the victim attempts to manage the abuser's rage and minimize the risk of violent retaliation. It's like walking a tightrope, explains Dr. Sarah Martinez, a psychologist who specializes in domestic violence dynamics. The victim knows they're in danger, but they also know that openly acknowledging the danger could make it worse. So they smile and say everything's fine, hoping that if they don't provoke their abuser, they might make it out safely. Jennifer's TikTok video, viewed through this lens, takes on a different meaning. Yes, she was declaring her independence, but she was doing so in the most non-confrontational way possible. She didn't mention Brandon by name. She didn't air grievances or assign blame. She focused entirely on her own journey, her own growth, her own future. It was a carefully crafted message designed to assert her autonomy while minimizing the threat to Brandon's ego. But here's the cruel reality. For an abuser who is motivated by control, even the gentlest assertion of independence feels like an unforgivable betrayal. As the days passed, there were signs, small ones easy to miss, that the situation in the Sheffield household was deteriorating. A neighbor reported hearing raised voices one evening, though the words were indistinguishable. Another neighbor mentioned that Brandon seemed tense during a brief conversation over the fence, though nothing about the exchange seemed particularly alarming at the time. Jennifer confided to one close friend that the living situation was difficult, but that she was managing. She said she was being careful to avoid arguments, to keep things calm for the sake of the girls. She was counting down the days until she could move out and truly begin her new life. She didn't elaborate on what being careful meant. She didn't explain what exactly she was managing. And her friend, wanting to be supportive but not intrusive, didn't press for details. This, too, is part of the insidious nature of domestic violence. Victims become experts at minimizing, at downplaying, at protecting their abusers even while trying to escape them. They fear that speaking the full truth will make them seem dramatic, or that it will force them into a confrontation they're not ready for, or that it will result in consequences they can't predict or control. Meanwhile, Christmas came and went. The Sheffield family celebrated together, or at least went through the motions. There are photos from that day. The girls opening presents, a holiday meal, the trappings of normalcy. Jennifer posted a brief message on social media wishing everyone a Merry Christmas and expressing gratitude for her blessings. What was happening in Brandon's mind during this period? Without a trial, without his testimony, without access to his inner world, we can only speculate based on patterns that researchers have identified in similar cases. Men who kill their intimate partners typically exhibit certain characteristics. They view their partners as possessions rather than autonomous individuals. They interpret any assertion of independence as a personal attack. They would rather destroy what they can't control than allow it to exist outside their dominion. As Jennifer made plans to leave, as she asserted her right to her own life, Brandon likely experienced her actions as an intolerable rejection. The woman he had controlled for years, through subtle manipulation, psychological pressure, and the simple assertion of male authority, was slipping away from him. And if he couldn't have her, couldn't control her, couldn't keep her in the role he had assigned to her, then no one would. This is the logic of annihilation. This is the thinking that turns a domestic dispute into a murder. December 27th passed. Jennifer worked a shift at the hospital. She came home. She interacted with her daughters. She prepared for a family visit that had been scheduled for the following day. Relatives coming by to check in, to offer support during this difficult transition, to spend time with the girls. Did she sense danger that night? Did she feel afraid? Or had the weeks of careful management, of protective pretense, of insisting everything was fine lulled her into believing she might actually make it through this safely? We'll never know what Jennifer was thinking or feeling in those final hours. We don't know if she went to bed that night planning what to pack for her new apartment, or imagining the future she was so close to claiming, or simply hoping to get through one more day. What we know is that when December 28, 2024 dawned, Jennifer Sheffield had only hours to live. The 18-day window, that period of peak danger that domestic violence experts warn about, that statistically represents the most lethal time for victims of intimate partner violence, was about to close in the most tragic way possible. By the end of that day, Jennifer would be dead. Her daughters would be motherless. And a community would be left to grapple with a devastating question. How did no one see this coming? But perhaps the more honest question is this: did we see it and simply not recognize it for what it was? Did we mistake a desperate survival strategy for genuine amicability? Did we applaud Jennifer's grace and maturity when we should have been calling the police? These are uncomfortable questions. They implicate not just Brandon, who bears full responsibility for his actions, but also a society that still, in 2024, fails to adequately understand and respond to the dynamics of domestic violence. December 28, 2024 began like many other winter mornings in Brandon, Mississippi. The sun rose over quiet suburban streets. Coffee makers gurgled to life in kitchens throughout the neighborhood. People prepared for the post-holiday workweek, running last-minute errands, returning to their routines after the disruption of Christmas celebrations. For the relatives who had planned to visit Jennifer and Brandon that day, the morning started with anticipation. This was meant to be a supportive visit, a chance to check in on the family during what everyone acknowledged was a difficult time. There might be some awkwardness. There always is when a marriage is ending, but the visit was well-intentioned. They wanted Jennifer to know she had support. They wanted to spend time with Gracie and Kylie. They wanted to offer whatever help might be needed. Several family members coordinated their arrival, planning to show up around midday when everyone would presumably be awake and ready for company. As they drove through the familiar streets of Brandon, making their way to the Sheffield home, none of them had any sense of foreboding. This was a welfare visit in the most innocent sense, checking on the well-being of loved ones. The first vehicle pulled up outside the house sometime around noon. Then another. Family members gathered on the front lawn, noticing immediately that both Jennifer's and Brandon's cars were parked in the garage. "They're home," someone said, stating what seemed obvious. They approached the front door and knocked. No answer. They knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. One of them pulled out their phone and called Jennifer's number. The call went straight to voicemail. They tried Brandon's phone. Same result. This was when the first tendrils of concern began to curl through the group. It wasn't just that no one was answering the door. People oversleep, miss doorbells, find themselves in the shower or otherwise occupied. But both phones going to voicemail, both cars in the garage. And this was a planned visit. Jennifer had confirmed it just the day before. They walked around the perimeter of the house, peering through windows. The curtains were drawn in most rooms, offering little visibility. One family member tried the back door. Locked. They returned to the front porch and knocked again, this time calling out names. "Jennifer! Brandon! Are you in there? It's us." The silence that answered was oppressive, almost physical. The neighborhood around them went about its business. A dog barked in the distance. A car drove past. The wind rustled through the bare branches of winter trees. But from inside the Sheffield home, there was only silence. Minutes ticked by. 10, 15, 20. The family members looked at each other, seeing their own worry reflected in one another's faces. Something was wrong. They could feel it now, that instinctive recognition that goes beyond logic, that taps into some primal awareness of danger. "We need to call the police," someone finally said. At approximately 12:47 p.m., a 911 call was placed to the Brandon Police Department requesting a welfare check at the Sheffield residence. The dispatcher, noting the concern in the caller's voice and the details being provided, 2 adults, 2 children, doors locked, cars present, no response, assigned the call a priority status. Within minutes, a patrol car pulled up to the house. Officer Derek Thompson and his partner, Officer Maria Gonzalez, approached the residence. The family members who had been waiting outside rushed to meet them, words tumbling out in an anxious stream. "They're not answering. Both cars are here. The doors are locked. We're supposed to be visiting. They knew we were coming. Jennifer isn't answering her phone. Brandon isn't answering his phone. Something's wrong. We can feel that something's wrong." Officers Thompson and Gonzalez had conducted hundreds of welfare checks over their combined decades of service. The vast majority turn out to be nothing. Someone's phone died, plans changed and communication broke down. A family was out for a walk or had fallen asleep. There's almost always nothing. But every officer also carries with them the memory of the times it wasn't nothing. The times they arrived to find someone who had suffered a medical emergency or an overdose or worse. They treat every welfare check with appropriate seriousness. "We're going to check it out," Officer Thompson told the family members. "Please stay here while we assess the situation." The officers approached the front door. They knocked, identified themselves loudly as police conducting a welfare check, and waited for a response. Nothing. They circled the house, looking for any signs of disturbance, any indication of what might be happening inside. Everything appeared normal. No broken windows, no signs of forced entry, no obvious external damage. This actually heightened their concern. If there's been a home invasion or break-in, there are usually visible signs. The absence of such signs can actually indicate something worse, something happening entirely within the family unit. After conferring briefly, the officers made the decision to enter the residence. In situations where there's a reasonable belief that someone inside may be in danger or in need of medical assistance, officers have the legal authority to make entry. This was one of those situations. Officer Gonzalez radioed for backup and medical standby while Officer Thompson examined the lock on the front door. Within minutes, they had gained entry to the house. The first thing that struck them was the silence. In a home where 2 adults and 2 children were believed to be present, the profound quiet was immediately disturbing. They moved carefully through the entryway, calling out as they went. "Brandon Police Department. We're conducting a welfare check. If anyone can hear us, please respond." Nothing. They moved deeper into the house, clearing rooms one by one according to their training. Living room, empty. Kitchen, empty. The house appeared neat, orderly. No signs of struggle. No overturned furniture. No indication that anything violent had occurred. This made what they found in the next room even more jarring. The exact details of the crime scene are not being fully disclosed here out of respect for the victims and their family. But what Officers Thompson and Gonzalez discovered when they entered that room would haunt them for the rest of their careers. Jennifer Sheffield lay deceased. Brandon Sheffield lay deceased. The physical evidence at the scene told a clear and terrible story. Brandon had shot Jennifer, then turned the weapon on himself. Officer Gonzalez immediately radioed for homicide detectives and the coroner while Officer Thompson secured the scene. The backup officers who had just arrived were tasked with ensuring the rest of the house was clear, and with the heartbreaking duty of confirming that the 2 daughters were not present in the home. Thankfully, and this bears emphasizing, Gracie and Kylie were not in the house when the murder-suicide occurred. The girls were elsewhere, presumably with other family members or at a friend's house. This small mercy meant they were spared the trauma of witnessing the violence or discovering the bodies. It was the only grace in an otherwise graceless situation. As more officers arrived and the house transformed into an active crime scene, the family members waiting outside knew, with sinking certainty, that their loved ones were gone. They could see it in the officers' faces, in the sudden flurry of activity, in the arrival of unmarked detective vehicles and the coroner's van. One by one, they were approached and told the news. Jennifer Sheffield, beloved nurse, devoted mother, woman who had been planning her independent future just 18 days earlier, was dead. Brandon Sheffield, the man she had married with hope and optimism 15 years prior, had killed her and then himself. The family members reacted with shock, with disbelief, with anguished crying, with that particular kind of numbness that occurs when the mind simply cannot process what it's being told. Some collapsed. Others stood frozen. Several had to be physically supported by the officers who had delivered the news. And somewhere, Gracie and Kylie, ages that haven't been publicly disclosed to protect their privacy, were about to learn that their parents were gone, that their mother had been murdered, that their father had been the one who murdered her, that in a single morning, their entire world had been shattered beyond recognition. Inside the house, detectives began the meticulous work of documenting everything. Photographs were taken from every angle. Measurements were recorded. Evidence was collected. Ballistics experts were called in. The medical examiner arrived to examine the bodies in situ before they were transported for autopsy. Even in those early hours of the investigation, the conclusion was already becoming clear. This was a murder-suicide. There was no indication of any third-party involvement. No signs of forced entry. No evidence of robbery or any motive unrelated to the domestic situation. Everything at the scene pointed to the same tragic narrative. A man who had decided that if he couldn't have his wife, no one would. By early evening on December 28, 2024, the investigation had moved from the scene to the police station, where detectives would begin the process of building a comprehensive understanding of what had happened and why. But the fundamental facts were already established. Jennifer Sheffield had been murdered by her husband. Brandon Sheffield had then died by suicide. And 2 daughters had become orphans in the space of a single terrible morning. The illusion of the perfect divorce had been shattered, revealed for what it always was. A desperate attempt by a woman to escape danger, and a trap from which she ultimately could not free herself. In the days following the discovery of Jennifer and Brandon Sheffield's bodies, the Brandon Police Department launched a comprehensive investigation. While the physical evidence clearly indicated a murder-suicide, detectives knew they needed to understand the complete picture. Not just what happened, but why it happened, and whether there were any warning signs that had been missed. The forensic investigation began at the scene and would eventually extend to every aspect of the Sheffields' lives. Their digital footprints, their financial records, their relationships with friends and family, their professional lives, and the seemingly invisible dynamics of their marriage. The ballistics analysis provided clear and unambiguous findings. Brandon Sheffield was definitively identified as the shooter. The weapon used in the murder-suicide was registered to Brandon, a firearm he had owned legally for several years, ostensibly for home protection. The shell casings found at the scene, the powder residue patterns, the trajectory analysis, and the positioning of the bodies all supported the same conclusion. Brandon had shot Jennifer, then turned the weapon on himself. The forensic evidence ruled out any possibility of a third party being involved. There had been no struggle with an intruder, no home invasion gone wrong, no mysterious assailant who had killed both victims and staged the scene. This was intimate partner violence in its most lethal form. Lead Detective Marcus Rivera, who had been with the Brandon Police Department for 17 years and had worked numerous homicide cases, would later reflect on the investigation. From a purely evidentiary standpoint, this was one of the more straightforward cases I've worked. The physical evidence told a clear story. But understanding why, really understanding the psychology behind it, that was more complex. While the ballistics team worked on the physical evidence, digital forensics investigators dove into the Sheffield's online presence. What they found was revealing, painting a picture of a marriage that had been deteriorating long before the public divorce announcement. Jennifer's social media accounts, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, were examined in detail. The investigation revealed a carefully curated public image. Jennifer's posts about her marriage had always been positive, but there was a noticeable shift in tone over the past year. Earlier posts frequently featured couple photos, anniversary celebrations, expressions of gratitude for her husband. More recent posts focused almost exclusively on her children, her career, or inspirational quotes about personal growth and change. The December 10th TikTok video received particular attention. Investigators watched it repeatedly, analyzing not just Jennifer's words but her facial expressions, body language, tone of voice. What they saw was a woman putting on a brave face, emphasizing positivity and growth while carefully avoiding any criticism of her soon-to-be ex-husband. Dr. Rebecca Walsh, a forensic psychologist consulted on the case, analyzed the video and provided insight. Jennifer is exhibiting what we call protective language patterns. Notice how she frames everything in terms of her own choices and growth, never once suggesting that Brandon did anything wrong or that she's leaving because of his behavior. This is typical of domestic violence victims who are trying to maintain the appearance of an amicable separation as a safety strategy. They believe, sometimes correctly, that publicly criticizing their abuser or revealing the true nature of the relationship will provoke retaliation. Brandon's social media presence was sparser but equally revealing. His Facebook status had changed to single around the same time as Jennifer's, but he had made no other posts about the separation. In fact, his last post of any kind had been 2 months prior to his death, a shared meme about fatherhood that had gotten a handful of likes from friends. What was more interesting to investigators was Brandon's activity in the weeks following the divorce announcement. According to the digital forensics report, Brandon had been viewing Jennifer's profile multiple times daily. He had looked at her TikTok video repeatedly. He had searched for information about divorce proceedings, custody arrangements, and alimony calculations. He had also, investigators discovered, been visiting websites and forums focused on men's rights in divorce, where angry ex-husbands congregate to share grievances and, in some of the darker corners of these online spaces, discuss women as enemies who deserve punishment. This digital trail provided insight into Brandon's deteriorating mental state. He was obsessively monitoring Jennifer's online presence while simultaneously immersing himself in content that portrayed women seeking independence as betrayers deserving of retribution. As detectives interviewed friends, family members, neighbors, and colleagues of both Jennifer and Brandon, a more complete and more disturbing picture emerged. Jennifer's co-workers at the hospital provided consistent testimony about her character and behavior. Nurse supervisor Patricia Henderson told detectives, "Jennifer was one of our best nurses, skilled, compassionate, reliable. But over the past year or so, I noticed changes. She seemed more stressed, more withdrawn. She'd always been social with the staff, but she started keeping more to herself. If we invited her to happy hour or dinner, she'd usually decline, saying she needed to get home." When pressed, Henderson recalled a conversation from several months before Jennifer's death. "I asked her once if everything was okay at home. She gave me this bright smile and said everything was fine, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. I didn't push because, well, you don't want to be intrusive. But I've thought about that conversation a lot since this happened. I wish I had pushed. I wish I had asked more questions." Other colleagues reported similar observations. Jennifer had become more guarded over time. She rarely talked about her husband anymore. When Brandon occasionally picked her up from work, co-workers noticed that Jennifer seemed to tense up when she saw his car, though she always put on a smile before walking out to meet him. One colleague, who asked to remain anonymous, told investigators something particularly chilling. About 2 months before she died, Jennifer came to work with a bruise on her upper arm. When I asked about it, she said she'd bumped into a door, but the bruise was shaped like finger marks, like someone had grabbed her hard. I wanted to say something, but she was so insistent that it was nothing, and I didn't want to overstep. I've been replaying that moment in my head ever since. I should have said something. I should have done something. Family members provided additional context. Jennifer's sister, speaking through tears during her interview, revealed that Jennifer had confided in her about difficulties in the marriage. She told me Brandon had become more controlling over the years. He questioned where she went, who she talked to, how she spent money. He wanted to know her schedule at all times. He'd get angry if she worked late or if she made plans with friends without checking with him first. It was like she needed his permission for everything. The sister continued, "But Jennifer also made me promise not to say anything to anyone else in the family. She said she was handling it, that she had a plan to leave safely. She made me swear not to confront Brandon or tell our parents because she was afraid it would make things worse. So I kept her secret. And now she's dead, and I have to live with that." Brandon's friends and acquaintances painted a picture of a man who had become increasingly isolated and bitter. A former coworker described Brandon as someone who had strong opinions about how things should be, especially when it came to family and marriage. He had pretty traditional views about gender roles. The man should be the provider and decision-maker. The wife should focus on home and children. I think Jennifer's career success and independence bothered him more than he let on. A neighbor who had known the Sheffields for years told investigators, "I saw Brandon a few days before it happened. We were both getting our mail and I asked him how he was doing with everything, the divorce. He got this look on his face like he was furious but trying to hold it in. He said, 'She thinks she can just walk away. She thinks she doesn't need me. We'll see about that.' At the time, I thought it was just angry talk, People say things when they're hurt. I never imagined he meant it literally. As detectives compiled the witness statements, a clear pattern emerged. What Jennifer had publicly portrayed as a sudden decision to divorce was actually the culmination of years of increasing control and psychological abuse. Coercive control, the term used by domestic violence experts to describe a pattern of behavior designed to make a victim subordinate and dependent, had been a defining feature of the Sheffield marriage. Brandon's behavior fit the textbook definition, monitoring Jennifer's activities and communications, controlling her access to money, isolating her from friends and family, undermining her confidence, and using intimidation to enforce compliance. Dr. Walsh, the forensic psychologist, explained to investigators, coercive control is often invisible to outsiders because it doesn't leave physical marks. The victim learns to self-police, to anticipate the abuser's reactions and modify their behavior accordingly. From the outside, it might look like the victim is simply being accommodating or considerate. But inside the relationship, there's a constant atmosphere of fear and monitoring. This explained why so many people had been shocked by Brandon's violence. He hadn't been physically abusive in any way that was publicly visible. There were no prior domestic violence calls to the residence, no restraining orders, no documented incidents of assault. But the absence of physical violence before the murder doesn't mean the abuse wasn't present. It simply means it took a different form, one that our society is still learning to recognize and take seriously. The financial investigation revealed another important dimension of the story. In the months before her death, Jennifer had been quietly preparing for financial independence. She had opened a separate bank account. She had been setting aside small amounts of money from each paycheck, not enough to be immediately noticeable, but enough to gradually build an emergency fund. She had also been researching apartment rentals in the Brandon area, looking for places that would be affordable on her nursing salary alone. Browser history from her phone showed multiple searches for family law attorneys, child custody information, and resources for women leaving marriages. Jennifer had been planning her escape methodically and carefully. She understood that leaving would be dangerous, and she was trying to do everything right. Building financial stability, researching her legal options, preparing for the logistics of moving out with her daughters. What she couldn't have anticipated was that Brandon would choose murder over allowing her to leave. Because of the clear physical evidence and the unambiguous conclusion of murder-suicide, there was never any question of this case going cold or remaining unsolved. Within days of the bodies being discovered, the investigation had established what happened with certainty. But Detective Rivera noted something important. This isn't a cold case in the traditional sense, but it's cold in a different way. We know what happened, but we'll never really know why Brandon made the choice he made. We can understand the psychology, the pattern of abuse, the dynamics of control. But the specific moment when he decided to kill Jennifer and himself, what was he thinking? What did he feel? Did he plan it for days, or was it an impulsive decision in a moment of rage? Those answers died with him. This absence of answers is another cruelty inflicted on the victims' families. There will be no trial where they can hear testimony, no sentencing where they can make victim impact statements, no moment of legal closure where the perpetrator is forced to account for his actions. Brandon Sheffield ensured, through his suicide, that he would never have to answer for what he did. After weeks of investigation, the official conclusion was straightforward. Jennifer Sheffield was murdered by her husband, Brandon Sheffield, who then died by suicide. The motive was identified as loss of control, Brandon's inability to accept Jennifer's independence and his decision that if he couldn't have her, no one would. The case was closed. The evidence was overwhelming. The conclusion was inescapable. But for those who loved Jennifer, for her two daughters who would grow up without their mother, for a community trying to understand how such a tragedy could happen in their midst, the case would never truly be closed. The investigation had answered what happened. It had provided insight into why it happened. But it couldn't undo the harm, couldn't bring Jennifer back, couldn't repair the lives that had been shattered. Justice, in any meaningful sense, was impossible. The person responsible was dead. All that remained was grief, trauma, and the devastating knowledge that Jennifer had done everything she could to escape safely, and it still hadn't been enough. In the aftermath of Jennifer Sheffield's murder, Domestic violence advocates, therapists, law enforcement professionals, and the public at large found themselves grappling with a difficult question. How could a separation that seemed so amicable end in such violence? The answer to this question reveals uncomfortable truths about domestic violence, about how we as a society understand and respond to it, and about the invisible dangers that lurk behind closed doors. Dr. Elena Martinez, director of the Domestic Violence Response Center in Jackson, Mississippi, has worked with victims of intimate partner violence for over 20 years. In the wake of the Sheffield tragedy, she spoke publicly about a phenomenon that professionals in her field see all too often. Victims frequently portray their separations as amicable, mutual, and respectful, even when the reality behind closed doors is quite different. They do this for a very simple reason: survival. If you publicly acknowledge that your partner is abusive, if you criticize them or reveal the true nature of the relationship, you risk provoking exactly the kind of violent retaliation that you're trying to avoid. This protective pretense serves multiple purposes. First, it allows the victim to maintain a veneer of control over the narrative. By insisting everything is fine, they attempt to manage the abuser's ego and minimize feelings of humiliation or rage that could trigger violence. Second, it protects the victim from judgment. Society still tends to ask victim-blaming questions. Why didn't you leave sooner? Weren't there signs? Why did you stay? By portraying the separation as mutual and peaceful, victims preempt these questions and avoid having to defend their choices and actions. Third, in cases where children are involved, victims often believe, sometimes correctly, that portraying the separation as amicable will make co-parenting easier and will spare their children from being caught in the middle of explicit conflict. Jennifer's December 10th TikTok video is a textbook example of protective pretense. She focused entirely on positive framing, personal growth, new beginnings, independence, self-discovery. She made no mention of Brandon's behavior, no suggestion that she was leaving because of any problems in the relationship, no indication that she felt unsafe or controlled. To viewers, especially those unfamiliar with domestic violence dynamics, this seemed like healthy, mature communication. Look at how well she's handling this difficult situation, people thought. Look at how positive and forward-thinking she is. But domestic violence professionals saw something different. They saw a woman carefully crafting a message that would assert her autonomy while minimizing the threat to her abuser's sense of control. They saw someone walking a tightrope, trying to claim her freedom without provoking lethal retaliation. The statistics on intimate partner homicide are stark and sobering. According to research compiled by the National Domestic Violence Hotline and the Bureau of Justice Statistics, approximately 70% of intimate partner murders happen after the victim has left the relationship or announced their intention to leave. Women are 70 times more likely to be killed in the 2 weeks after leaving an abusive partner than at any other time during the relationship. Separation violence accounts for a significant percentage of all homicides of women in the United States. When an abuser has made threats to kill, the risk of actual homicide increases by 500%. These numbers reflect a terrible truth. The moment a victim decides to leave is often the moment they are in the greatest danger. Dr. Jacqueline Campbell, a leading researcher on intimate partner homicide at Johns Hopkins University, explains the psychology. For abusers whose primary method of control is psychological domination, the victim's decision to leave represents an unacceptable challenge to their authority. They view their partner as a possession, not a person. The idea that this possession might escape their control and exist independently is intolerable. For some abusers, murder becomes their final act of control. If I can't have you, no one will. This dynamic is known as separation violence or separation homicide, and it's a well-documented phenomenon in domestic violence research. Yet despite decades of study and awareness campaigns, the general public remains largely unaware of this heightened danger. When Jennifer announced her divorce, when she posted that TikTok video about independence, when she made it clear that she was leaving and starting a new life, she crossed an invisible line. She challenged Brandon's control in a way that he found unforgivable. And 18 days later, he killed her. With the benefit of hindsight, we can now see that Jennifer was employing a protective strategy throughout the separation. She portrayed the divorce as mutual and amicable rather than one-sided. avoided criticizing Brandon publicly, emphasized personal growth rather than relationship problems, maintained a positive, non-confrontational tone in all public communications, continued living in the same house while planning her exit, tried to maintain normalcy for the sake of her daughters. These were not the actions of someone who was oblivious to danger. These were the calculated moves of someone who understood, at least to some degree, that she was in a high-risk situation and was trying to navigate it safely. But here's the devastating reality. Even when victims do everything right, even when they plan carefully, maintain protective pretense, seek resources, and try to minimize confrontation, it sometimes isn't enough. Brandon's need for control was stronger than Jennifer's ability to manage it safely. Domestic violence advocates emphasize that we cannot blame Jennifer for any aspect of what happened to her. She made reasonable, thoughtful choices based on the information and resources available to her. She tried to protect herself and her daughters. The blame lies entirely with Brandon, who made the choice to respond to his loss of control with lethal violence. One of the reasons Jennifer's murder shocked her community is that there had been no publicly visible signs of physical abuse in the relationship. No hospital visits with suspicious injuries. No police calls to the residence. No restraining orders or documented incidents of domestic violence. This absence of physical violence led many people to assume the relationship had been healthy, or at least not dangerous, until the sudden explosion of lethal violence on December 28. But domestic violence experts recognize that the absence of physical abuse doesn't mean the absence of abuse. Coercive control can be just as damaging and just as dangerous as physical violence. Coercive control is a pattern of behavior designed to make a victim subordinate and dependent by isolating them from support, exploiting their resources, depriving them of independence, and regulating their everyday behavior. Can include monitoring communications and activities, controlling access to money and resources, isolating the victim from friends and family, enforcing trivial demands and rules, degrading the victim's self-worth, using intimidation to enforce compliance, making threats about consequences of non-compliance. Based on the witness statements collected during the investigation, it's clear that Brandon engaged in many of these controlling behaviors. He monitored Jennifer's schedule and whereabouts. He questioned her interactions with others. He became angry when she made independent decisions. He held traditional views about gender roles and became threatened by Jennifer's professional success. In many jurisdictions around the world, coercive control has been recognized as a criminal offense in its own right, separate from physical assault. In the United States, awareness of coercive control is growing, but it remains difficult to prosecute and is often not taken seriously until it escalates to physical violence. Jennifer lived in an invisible cage. From the outside, her marriage looked intact, even happy. But inside the relationship, her autonomy was systematically undermined. Her choices were restricted, and her independence was punished. When she finally decided to leave that cage, Brandon killed her. Without Brandon alive to provide testimony, psychological analysis of his mindset must rely on behavioral patterns and research into similar cases. Dr. Thomas Reynolds, a forensic psychiatrist who reviewed the Sheffield case file, offered this assessment. Brandon fits a common profile of intimate partner homicide perpetrators. These individuals typically exhibit narcissistic traits and an external locus of control, meaning they blame others for their problems rather than taking personal responsibility. They view their partners as extensions of themselves rather than autonomous individuals. They interpret independence as abandonment and betrayal. Dr. Reynolds continued, for someone like Brandon, Jennifer's success as a nurse, her growing confidence, her plans for independence, all of these would have been experienced as threats to his masculine identity and his role as the dominant partner. The decision to divorce wasn't just about ending a marriage. It was a direct challenge to his authority and control. And he couldn't tolerate that challenge. This psychological framework doesn't excuse Brandon's actions. Nothing could excuse them. But it does provide context for understanding how a man who had never been physically violent before could escalate to murder. The research on intimate partner homicide shows that perpetrators often exhibit an all-or-nothing mentality. They reason, if I can't have my partner, no one will. They prefer their partner dead rather than alive and independent. They view murder-suicide as a way to reassert control and avoid the humiliation of being left. In Brandon's final act, he destroyed Jennifer, destroyed himself, and traumatized his daughters, all to avoid the unacceptable reality that Jennifer was a person with agency who had the right to leave him. The period between Jennifer's TikTok video on December 10th and her murder on December 28th, exactly 18 days, has become a focal point in discussions about separation violence. Research has identified the first few weeks after a victim announces their intention to leave as the highest risk period for intimate partner homicide. During this window, several dangerous factors converge. The abuser realizes their control is slipping away. The victim is still physically accessible, often still living in the same home. The abuser hasn't yet accepted the reality of the separation. Planning for murder may occur if the abuser decides he'd rather kill than lose control. Domestic violence professionals often refer to this as the danger zone, a period when interventions, protective measures, and safety planning are most critical. But Jennifer, like so many victims, may not have fully recognized the level of danger she was in. She was trying to manage the situation carefully. She was maintaining the protective pretense. She was counting down the days until she could move out and truly be free. She didn't make it. In the wake of Jennifer's death, many people asked, could this have been prevented? Were there interventions that might have saved her life? The honest answer is complex. Domestic violence prevention requires multiple levels of intervention. Jennifer was already doing many things right. Planning her exit, building financial independence, maintaining protective communication. What she might have benefited from was direct connection with domestic violence resources, safety planning with a professional advocate, and possibly a protection order, though research shows these can sometimes escalate danger rather than mitigate it. Friends, family, and colleagues saw signs but didn't know how to respond. Better education about domestic violence dynamics, coercive control, and separation danger could have equipped them to provide more effective support or intervention. Law enforcement and legal systems need better tools for identifying and intervening in coercive control situations before they escalate to physical violence. Risk assessment tools, coordinated community responses, and resources for both victims and potential perpetrators could make a difference. Cultural attitudes about relationships, gender roles, and masculinity contribute to intimate partner violence. Challenging the belief that men have a right to control their partners, that women exist to serve male needs, and that violence is an acceptable response to loss of control, these broader cultural shifts are essential for long-term prevention. But even with all of these interventions in place, some perpetrators will still choose violence. We cannot prevent every tragedy. What we can do is reduce the frequency, provide better support for survivors, and ensure that victims like Jennifer are remembered not as cautionary tales but as human beings whose lives mattered and whose deaths demand accountability. Not from the victims, but from perpetrators and from a society that enables them. Jennifer Sheffield's death has become a catalyst for conversations about domestic violence in Brandon, Mississippi, and beyond. Local organizations have reported increases in calls to their hotlines. Community members are asking how they can better support friends and family members who might be in dangerous relationships. Law enforcement is reviewing protocols for responding to domestic situations involving coercive control. Jennifer's story, tragic as it is, has the potential to save lives if it awakens people to the realities of intimate partner violence and the particular dangers of separation. But the greatest tragedy is that Jennifer should be here to see that impact. She should be alive, living in her own apartment, pursuing her dreams, raising her daughters, continuing her work as a nurse, building the independent life she was so close to claiming. Instead, she's a statistic. Another woman killed by her intimate partner. Another victim of separation violence. Another life cut short because a man couldn't tolerate losing control. Her death was preventable. Her murder was a choice Brandon made. And her memory demands that we do better, for the Gracies and Kylies of the world, and for all the women who are, even now, trying to escape dangerous relationships. In most murder cases, there is a clear progression. Investigation, arrest, trial, verdict, sentencing. This legal process, while often painful for families, provides structure, closure, and a sense that justice, however imperfect, has been served. The Sheffield case followed a different trajectory. Because Brandon Sheffield died by suicide immediately after murdering his wife, there would be no arrest, no trial, no jury verdict, no sentencing hearing. The case was classified as solved and closed within days of the bodies being discovered. This absence of legal proceedings creates a unique and complicated form of grief for the victims' loved ones. On January 15, 2025, barely 3 weeks after the discovery of the bodies, the Brandon Police Department held a press conference to announce the official conclusion of their investigation. Chief of Police Robert Martinez addressed the media. Based on forensic evidence, witness statements, and a thorough examination of all available information, we have determined that Jennifer Sheffield was murdered by her husband, Brandon Sheffield, who then died by suicide. There is no evidence of any third-party involvement. This case is considered closed. The announcement was brief, factual, and final. Reporters asked questions about motive, about warning signs, about whether police had been called to the residence before. Chief Martinez answered what he could while maintaining appropriate boundaries around victim privacy and the dignity of the investigation. What he couldn't answer, what no one could answer, were the why questions that mattered most to those who loved Jennifer. Why did Brandon make this choice? What was he thinking in those final moments? Did he plan this for days, or was it an impulsive act of rage? Did Jennifer know what was about to happen? Was she afraid? Did she suffer? These questions, Chief Martinez acknowledged, would never be fully answered. When a perpetrator dies at the scene, we lose the opportunity to understand his mindset through testimony or interrogation. We can make educated inferences based on the evidence, but we'll never have his account of what happened and why. For Jennifer's family, this absence of answers is an additional burden. They're left to piece together the story from fragments, witness statements, social media posts, their own memories of conversations and interactions. They'll never have the complete picture, never hear Brandon explain himself, never get to confront him in a courtroom. Perhaps the most controversial aspect of the Sheffield case emerged in the days following the tragedy, when plans were announced for a memorial service. The service, organized by extended family members and held at a local church, was intended to honor both Jennifer and Brandon. For many in the community, this joint memorial struck a deeply uncomfortable note. How do you memorialize a murder victim alongside her murderer? How do you speak of them in the same context, as if their deaths were equal tragedies? The memorial service took place on January 8, 2025, with several hundred attendees. According to multiple reports from those who attended, the memorial displays and eulogies were notably imbalanced. Jennifer's section featured photos spanning her life: childhood pictures, nursing school graduation, wedding photos, images with her daughters, snapshots of her at work. There were testimonials from colleagues about her compassion and skill as a nurse. There were statements from friends about her kindness, her humor, her dreams for the future. There was a palpable sense of loss, not just of a life ended, but of a future stolen. Brandon's section, by comparison, was more subdued. There were fewer photos, more generic statements about him being a troubled soul who was now at peace. Some family members attempted to portray him sympathetically, suggesting he had been struggling and in pain. The implicit message seemed to be that Brandon was as much a victim as Jennifer. A victim of mental illness, of emotional turmoil, of circumstances beyond his control. This framing outraged many attendees, particularly domestic violence advocates and survivors who came to pay respects to Jennifer. The online backlash was swift and substantial. Social media posts criticized the joint memorial as inappropriate and disrespectful to Jennifer's memory. Opinion pieces appeared in local media questioning whether murderers who die by suicide should be memorialized at all, or whether doing so minimizes their crimes and dishonors their victims. Dr. Lisa Chun, a trauma therapist who works extensively with domestic violence survivors, wrote an op-ed in the Clarion Ledger that articulated many people's concerns. When we memorialize a murder-suicide perpetrator alongside his victim, we create a false equivalency. We suggest that the person who took a life and the person whose life was taken are equally deserving of our sympathy and remembrance. This is not only morally wrong, it's actively harmful to survivors of domestic violence who see this message and internalize the idea that their abuser's pain somehow justifies or mitigates the abuse. Family members who organized the joint memorial defended their decision, arguing that Brandon's daughters had lost both parents and deserved the opportunity to mourn their father alongside their mother. They suggested that Brandon's mental state at the time of the murder-suicide was compromised, that he wasn't in his right mind, that he wouldn't have done what he did if he had been thinking clearly. These arguments are not uncommon in cases of intimate partner homicide followed by suicide. Families of perpetrators understandably struggle to reconcile their memories of their loved one with the horrific actions they committed. They search for explanations that make sense: mental illness, temporary insanity, a moment of lost control. Anything that allows them to preserve some version of the person they thought they knew. But domestic violence experts are clear. Mental illness does not cause intimate partner violence, and murder-suicide is not an impulsive act of a momentarily deranged person. It is a deliberate choice made by someone who has decided that killing is preferable to losing control. Brandon Sheffield made a choice. He chose to end Jennifer's life and his own rather than allow her to live independently. This choice should not be excused, minimized, or memorialized as if it were a tragic accident. While the public debated the appropriateness of the memorial service, Jennifer's immediate family and closest friends were dealing with profound trauma and grief. Losing a loved one to murder is devastating under any circumstances. But losing a loved one to intimate partner homicide carries additional layers of trauma. Family and friends often torture themselves with what-ifs. What if I had said something? What if I had called the police? What if I had offered her a place to stay? What if I had confronted Brandon? Grief is compounded by rage at the perpetrator, horror at the violence, and the impossible task of explaining to children what happened and why. Many family members had known Brandon, liked him, trusted him. His actions forced them to reevaluate every interaction, every memory, every assumption they had made about him. High-profile cases like the Sheffield murder-suicide attract media attention. Family members find themselves navigating reporters, social media speculation, and public opinions about their private tragedy. Jennifer's sister, who had been one of the few people Jennifer confided in about her troubled marriage, has been particularly affected. In the one public statement she released, she wrote, "I live every day with the knowledge that Jennifer told me she was afraid, and I didn't do enough. She asked me to keep her secret because she thought going public would make things worse. I honored her request, and now she's dead. The burden of that will be with me for the rest of my life." Trauma therapists emphasize that this guilt, while understandable, is misplaced. Victims of domestic violence often ask their loved ones to keep their secrets, to not intervene, to let them handle it in their own way, explains Dr. Martinez. Family members who honor those requests are not responsible for what happens. The sole person responsible is the perpetrator. Blaming yourself for respecting a victim's autonomy is a form of self-punishment that victims themselves would not want their loved ones to endure. But knowing this intellectually doesn't always ease the emotional burden. In legal terms, the Sheffield case is resolved. The perpetrator has been identified with certainty. The crime has been documented and investigated. The case file is closed. But for those who love Jennifer, the concept of justice feels hollow. There was no day in court where they could face Brandon and tell him what his actions cost. There was no guilty verdict that acknowledged the wrong that was done. There was no sentencing hearing where they could deliver victim impact statements and watch Brandon be held accountable. Justice, in the traditional sense, requires that the perpetrator face consequences for their actions, explains legal scholar Professor Amanda Winters. When a perpetrator dies before facing trial, we lose that dimension of justice. We have answers about what happened, but we don't have the formal social acknowledgement of wrongdoing that comes with a verdict and sentence. This is not to suggest that Jennifer's family wishes Brandon had survived to face trial. Many have said explicitly that his death saved them from the ordeal of a trial. But the absence of legal proceedings leaves a void where closure might otherwise have existed. Some family members have found alternative paths to something resembling closure. Several of Jennifer's friends have become involved with domestic violence organizations, turning their grief into action. Jennifer's sister has spoken at community events about recognizing the signs of coercive control and understanding separation danger. Jennifer's colleagues at the hospital have created a support fund for domestic violence survivors seeking to leave dangerous relationships. These efforts honor Jennifer's memory and create meaning from tragedy. But they don't bring her back. They don't undo the harm. They don't restore what was lost. Throughout discussions of the Sheffield case, two names have been mentioned repeatedly but with minimal detail: Gracie and Kylie, the daughters who lost both parents in a single terrible day. Their exact ages have been kept private to protect their anonymity. What is known is that they are now in the care of relatives, likely Jennifer's family members. Though this has not been publicly confirmed, these girls face a uniquely devastating trauma. They lost their mother to violence. They lost their father to suicide. They must somehow reconcile the fact that their father killed their mother. They carry the genetic and psychological legacy of both victim and perpetrator. Research on children who lose parents to murder-suicide shows devastating long-term impacts: higher rates of PTSD, depression, and anxiety, difficulty forming secure attachments in future relationships, struggles with identity and self-worth, complicated grief that can last a lifetime, risk of repeating patterns in their own relationships. But research also shows that with appropriate support, trauma-informed therapy, stable caregiving, community support, educational assistance, these children can heal and build meaningful lives. Gracie and Kylie's identities have been carefully protected from media attention, and this is appropriate. They deserve privacy as they process their trauma and begin the long journey of healing. Jennifer's family has established a trust fund for the girls' education and therapeutic support. Community members have contributed donations. Mental health professionals have offered pro bono services. These are small gestures in the face of overwhelming loss, but they represent a community's commitment to ensuring that Gracie and Kylie have the resources they need to survive and eventually thrive despite the tragedy that has defined their early lives. The Sheffield case will never have justice in the traditional sense. There was no trial, no verdict, no sentence. The perpetrator escaped legal accountability through death. But perhaps there can be meaning. Perhaps Jennifer's story can save other lives by raising awareness about intimate partner violence, separation danger, and coercive control. Perhaps her death can motivate communities to better support domestic violence survivors. Perhaps her memory can inspire changes in how we respond to victims who reach out for help. These outcomes don't constitute justice. But in the absence of justice, they may be the best that Jennifer's loved ones can hope for. That her death, senseless and preventable as it was, might somehow contribute to preventing other deaths, other tragedies, other families torn apart by intimate partner violence. Jennifer Sheffield deserved to live. She deserved to claim the independence she was seeking. She deserved to raise her daughters and build the future she had planned. She didn't get that future, but perhaps her story can help ensure that other women do. In the months since Jennifer Sheffield's death, her name has appeared in countless news articles, social media posts, domestic violence awareness campaigns, and community conversations. She has become, in some ways, a symbol, a representation of the dangers of intimate partner violence and the particular lethality of separation. But Jennifer Sheffield was not a symbol. She was a person. She was a nurse who held patients' hands during scary procedures and remembered to ask about their grandchildren on return visits. She was a colleague who brought homemade cookies to share during night shifts and volunteered to take the least desirable holiday assignments so others could be with their families. She was a mother who created elaborate scavenger hunts for her daughters' birthdays, who read bedtime stories with different voices for each character, who never missed a school play or soccer game or parent-teacher conference. She was a sister who sent memes at random times just to make her siblings laugh, who remembered everyone's favorite desserts and always made them for family gatherings, who gave thoughtful advice when asked and silent support when words weren't enough. She was a friend who listened without judgment, celebrated others' successes with genuine joy, and showed up when people needed her, with casseroles after births, with presents after losses, with whatever was needed whenever it was needed. She was a student who approached learning with curiosity and enthusiasm, who asked thoughtful questions, who shared interesting articles with anyone who might appreciate them. She was a woman who loved reading, trying new recipes, watching crime documentaries. A tragic irony not lost on those who knew her. Decorating for holidays, planning elaborate surprises, and finding beauty in ordinary moments. These details matter. These small, specific, human details are what transform Jennifer from a statistic into a person. They remind us that when we talk about intimate partner homicide, we're not discussing abstract concepts or nameless victims. We're talking about real people with full, rich, complex lives that were cut short by violence. As of early 2025, Brandon Sheffield is deceased. There is no ongoing legal case, no perpetrator serving a sentence, no possibility of parole to oppose. Gracie and Kylie remain in the care of family members. Their identities and specific circumstances are protected, as they should be. Those who care for them report that the girls are receiving appropriate therapeutic support and that the family is focused on creating stability and safety as they navigate this unimaginable loss. Jennifer's position at the hospital remains vacant, a silent testament to the irreplaceable role she filled. Her colleagues have created a memorial scholarship in her name for nursing students who demonstrate exceptional compassion in patient care. The first scholarship will be awarded in May 2025. The Sheffield family home has been sold. New owners have moved in, unaware of the tragedy that occurred within those walls, or perhaps aware but willing to look past it. Life continues in that quiet suburban neighborhood. Children play, dogs bark, lawns are mowed, cars come and go. The mundane rhythms of daily existence have resumed, except for one family that will never be whole again. If Jennifer's story resonates with you, if you see yourself in her situation, if you recognize someone you love in her experience, please know that resources are available. Available 24/7. Trained advocates can provide support, safety planning, and connections to local resources. For survivors of sexual violence, providing crisis intervention and suicide prevention. For those who prefer text-based support, local domestic violence shelters, legal aid organizations, and counseling services exist in most communities. A quick internet search for domestic violence resources plus your location will provide options. Contact a domestic violence advocate to create a safety plan. Document abuse, photos, emails, texts, and store evidence safely outside your home. Build financial independence gradually if possible. Identify trusted people who can provide support. Recognize that the period immediately after leaving is the most dangerous time. Have an emergency escape plan. Express concern without judgment. Listen without pressuring them to leave before they're ready. Educate yourself about domestic violence dynamics. Offer specific, concrete support rather than general statements. Respect their autonomy while staying available. Understand that leaving is a process, not a single event. Jennifer Sheffield did many things right. She planned carefully. She maintained protective communication. She built financial independence. She sought to leave as safely as possible. And she was still murdered. This is the uncomfortable truth about intimate partner violence. Sometimes, even when victims do everything they can to protect themselves, they are still killed. This is not a failure on the part of the victim. It is a testament to how dangerous abusers can be and how much work our society still has to do in protecting vulnerable people. We cannot guarantee that every person who leaves a dangerous relationship will survive. But we can believe victims when they tell us they're afraid. Provide resources and support without judgment. Hold abusers accountable rather than asking why victims stayed. Educate ourselves and our communities about domestic violence dynamics. Challenge cultural attitudes that enable intimate partner violence. Support legislation and funding for domestic violence prevention and intervention. Jennifer Sheffield wanted to live independently, to raise her daughters, to continue her work as a nurse, to build a future on her own terms. She wanted to be free. She never got that chance. But her story, tragic as it is, has the potential to save lives. Every person who learns about separation danger, who recognizes coercive control, who supports a friend or family member leaving a dangerous relationship, who challenges attitudes that enable abuse, each of these people honors Jennifer's memory. Jennifer Sheffield was 30 years old when she died. She should be here. She should be alive, living in her own apartment, raising her daughters, continuing her work, building the independent life she was so close to achieving. She was stolen from this world by a man who valued control more than life, possession more than love, dominance more than humanity. Remember her name, remember her story, and let her death motivate us all to do better, to see more clearly, to intervene more effectively, to support more completely, and to create a world where women like Jennifer can leave dangerous relationships and survive. If you found Jennifer's story important, please share this video. Conversations about domestic violence save lives. The more people understand separation danger, coercive control, and the realities of intimate partner violence, the more lives we can protect. Subscribe to this channel for more in-depth true crime investigations that honor victims and examine the societal factors that enable violence. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new case. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, but please be respectful. Jennifer's family and friends may see these comments, and this is a real tragedy that has devastated real people. Most importantly, if you or someone you love is in danger, reach out for help. You deserve safety. You deserve support. You deserve to live. Jennifer Sheffield deserved to live. Remember her. This documentary was created to honor the memory of Jennifer Sheffield and to raise awareness about intimate partner violence. Our deepest condolences go to Jennifer's family, friends, and all who loved her.